Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That is Gavin. Gavin, this episode's going out on Wednesday the 13th. Is there anything special about Wednesday the 13th instead of Friday the 13th?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure something significant happened on January 13th. Actually, let me look. My mom actually got me as like a little stocking stuffer a desktop calendar for this day in science. So let's take a look.
Oh, that's awesome. So we're going to be able to see what happened on every... Maybe we can begin every episode with that. What happened today in science?
I really like that. So January 13th, 2017. Hot chili pepper consumption reduces mortality rates is the headline for that one.
Really? Does it say what kind?
Let's see. I'll read you. I'll read the full thing. An
Please
American
do.
study spanning more than 23 years and tracking 16,000 participants came to a close with data published on this day that supported an earlier Chinese study. So, referencing back to sort of a replication study. That's good science. Which also tracked the effects of red chili pepper consumption on mortality. Staggeringly, the American study demonstrated a nearly 13% reduction in total mortality across the 16,000 participants. Though the study did not uncover...
huge.
13%? That is massive. Let's see. Though the study did not uncover the exact component of the chilies that led to this decreased mortality rate, researchers believe that it relates to the ability of capsaicin, which gives peppers their heat, to the body's coronary blood flow and anti-obesity mechanics. Authors of the study hope their work will encourage health experts to more strongly recommend spicy chilies as part of the standard diet.
That's amazing. My girlfriend's parents got me some hot sauces for Christmas because I cannot handle any kind of spice. But now I guess I've got to take one for the team here if we want.
It's like,
if
hey,
we want some longevity.
Do you want to die? No? Eat some peppers.
That is what the science tells us. Wonderful. So this is the first episode that we are actually recording here in the new year. It is the second one that's actually going to be released here in the new year in 2021. And I'd like to say that things are looking up. Not quite sure I can say that yet, but we're getting there. I'd say that we're getting there, and I am looking forward to the episode we have today, if only because the title that you have for us is one that I'm going to be giggling at throughout the entire episode. Gavin, what's the title of what we have in our bullet points here?
So this episode is going to be about the Bone Wars, and just as
a
really quick aside. So there was one of the biggest organizations to be involved with in paleontology is called the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. And as with most things, this year it was held online, their annual meeting. And their auto content filters filtered out the words, like several paleontology related words, but the main one being bone. Yes. The largest paleontology conference of the year filtered out the word bone.
Was it when they were typing or talking? How could you not use the word bone?
So to be fair, I did not attend. I didn't want to pay money for a watered down conference because it was online, and it's mainly a networking opportunity, especially for young professionals such as myself. So I didn't go. So I don't know exactly, but I'm sure if you just look up just SVP, the letters, bone, I'm sure you will find many an article about it.
That sounds like an Onion headline. That really does.
I don't even think the Onion could have made that up. It was so funny. Anyway, yes, this episode is about the Bone Wars, which is
the Bone Wars,
a neat part of paleontological history to look back and talk about, but during the time was a really horrible time.
Okay, and when we're talking, when are we talking about here? Are we talking, how many millions of years ago are we talking?
Much less. Only about 150-ish million years, or 150-ish years ago.
Really? So this is something that's actually going to be not within the memory of anybody listening, but, there were humans around when this was going on. So I'm quite excited to learn about what exactly is going to be going on in
Absolutely.
the Bone Wars. Quick aside for all of our listeners, Gavin doesn't really tell me what it is that we're going to be learning about beforehand. I look at our notes ahead of time, and usually somewhere in there he called me stupid, where he plans on asking me a question, right. And he's like, actually, you're wrong with whatever you're going to answer. So I don't know what the Bone Wars are, but I am very much looking forward to finding out what people in the 1800s were doing for fun.
Yeah, so me picking on Mike aside, paleontology's had a really long, really dumb history, like with many things. And, paleontology, even though we're going to be talking about a time period in the late 1800s, paleontology itself sort of started quite a long time ago and is probably, I'll say possibly, the source of some things about like mythology with like dragons or elephant skulls are likely the source of like Greek legends about cyclopses, because elephants, the hole where like that is like their nostrils, because they have the trunk, there has to be a really weird morphology to their skull, but it's like in the middle in a spot where like a cyclops eye would be. So fun fact, that's, paleontology and, fossils are possibly a source of the origination of some different parts of mythology.
Really?
Yeah.
Hmm.
So we'll touch on some of the old history for a little bit. So it really started with the ancient Greeks just because they were super, super into collecting and describing and organizing things. Some of the first people to even try organizing different animals were some of the ancient Greeks, like Aristotle and, the typical super famous ones, just because they're like, oh, these things are sort of vaguely similar, so we should call them similar things. Something to that effect. But real sort of quote unquote modern paleontology started in, I'd say, the late 1700s to early 1800s ish.
And this is kind of when like there's actual science being done as opposed to just people finding things and ascribing meaning to them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is when things started to become sort of like a where they had like a methodology to them instead of just collect thing, assign it a name, or put it with other things, where it's like, okay, this thing checks these boxes. So there's a full methodology to it, or at least the startings of one. And that's especially true once you get into the middle and later 1800s, when taxonomy, which is the study of giving things names and sort of grouping them together based on relatedness, started to come about because Charles Darwin, his famous work on the origin of species was published in, I want to say 1864. So, and sometime in the 1860s. Don't quote me on that. But so with that, people didn't believe Darwin so much at first, but definitely by sort of the end of the 1800s, Darwinian evolution and starting to classify animals based on that became much more of a thing.
I've just looked it up. On the Origin of Species was published on November 24th, 1859.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Thank you.
It led to the Civil War.
Sure. Among many other things, because, Charles Darwin was definitely from the continent of North America, not European at all. But so the reason why sort of paleontology gets its start, among those other things that I talked about in the early 1800s, is just also better communication methods. People were able to communicate with each other better with sort of the advent of things like telegrams and sort of a more usable like postage system, as well as better collection methods, just sort of as, the technology and methods sort of got better at keeping fossils organized, keeping them from falling apart. They just got better at keeping things, in a decent enough condition to be able to identify them properly when they bring them back to whatever institution they were working for, as well as sort of the thing that we can't really avoid talking about during this time period, which is colonization. As we've talked about before, paleontology and geology have a really long, very angering and very sad history involved with colonization. Geologists were some of the first people sent out west into like the Dakota Territory and places like that, looking for valuable resources and things. And some of those valuable resources that they found were fossils. So just wanted to throw that nugget in there. It's something that needs to be in the context of this time period.
And as we're talking about this time period, just to about the episode itself here, kind of, this sounds like it's going to be sort of a meta episode. Instead of it being about stuff that paleontology has discovered, this is going to be something of, a time period of paleontology itself. Is that kind of what we're going to be learning about today?
Definitely. So
Okay.
we'll learn a little bit about how paleontology works, but more accurately, how it's not supposed to work, because these people, while they did really important things, they did many also really bad things that we now know because of these people that these are not okay things to do.
Wonderful. So we've got the bone wars here. We've got a couple of things that sort of led to it with those communication methods, collection methods, and colonization. And when are we starting here? When do we actually begin the bone wars? When was the opening salvo?
So they sort of officially start in 1877 and go through 1892. So a 15-year period. And it's mainly between two people who have excellent names. There's Othniel Charles Marsh from Yale University, because Yale existed back then as well, and Edward Drinker Cope, who, I'm trying to remember the institution he was with. It was in Philadelphia. I think it was just the Academy of Natural Sciences.
I love old-timey names. It's one of my favorite things about history is just old-timey names.
Me too. And so there were a couple other people involved, but these were the main two. So they were both relatively old dudes at this time. They had obviously, bumped elbows at a handful of other things in their careers, but they were at fancy institutions back east, traveling west with, United States expansion into places like Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, the Dakotas. And there was like such an insane rivalry between these two that, God, I'm trying to think of like a sports analogy. What is like the most extreme sports analogy you can think of? You're more of a sports person than I am.
For what are we trying to?
Just like
what's the
pure
analogy?
hatred, like sabotage.
So I mean, I'm thinking here of either like a Yankees Red Sox rivalry in baseball, or
I think that's
like,
too tame, even.
Like what about like Duke and UNC for college basketball or college sports? Like where like they're that close and there's just that much vitriol between people.
I don't know. Do
More
either
than
of them
that?
resort to blowing up some things that belong to the other one?
Okay, so if that's what we're going for, off the top of my head, it's hard for me to come up with a sports analogy other than I assume there's some European soccer player that had a fan do something horrible to them because they take things a little too seriously over there. But yeah, I'm not sure there's a sports analogy that quite goes that far.
Yeah, that's and I'll get more into it when we talk about these two, but yeah, that's just the level of the insane competition. Of course, it ramped up over a good handful of years. They actually started their careers pretty like amicably. They were, I wouldn't say friends, but they at least could be in a room with each other without trying to kill the other one. But definitely by the end of the Bone Wars, I would say probably in like late 1880s, like I'm sure if they were ever put in the same room, they would get into a fist fight, like 100%. So as much as it pains me to say this, I say most scientific names given to extinct species, at least in North America, are from this time. So while these guys were giant idiots for a lot of reasons, they did some really, really good work. As I'm working on my master's thesis right now, basically any species or genus or family or whatever that is from this time period was named by one of these two people. So they did a lot of really, really good things, which we'll get to later. But of course, I want to talk about first why what they did was so egregiously horrible.
So correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like here we've got a couple of people that are very good paleontologists, if less than stellar humans.
I would say at the beginning, they were doing good science. Toward the end of it, no. And the biggest thing was because of that competition. So the most egregious thing that they did was because they were competing with each other to see who could name the most things. So anything that they thought might have been even slightly different than something else that they had found or that the other person had found, they would call it something different, which included things that weren't actually new. So a bullet point example that I have in here is an example of me versus my sister. You know, I am about 6 foot, 6'1" but my sister is like, I don't know, maybe 5'4", so she's pretty short. I'm sure if they found skeletons of us, like, obviously humans are the same species, but there's a really wide range of morphology differences that you can see even within a species. And so even if it was like, oh, this one's 2% larger than this other species that I found, I'm calling it a new species just so I can add another tally to my list.
This kind of reminds me to when we were talking before about dinosaurs, where you've got, within any species, there's going to be some variation. And so if you really wanted to just try and rack up as many different names as you can, you could find a whole bunch of different species of, like you said, of humans, from infant to, an NBA basketball player, and just say, oh, look at the size differences here. These must be different species. It almost sounds like, kind of we were doing with dinosaurs, or what paleontologists were doing with dinosaurs back earlier on, where just anything with any semblance of a difference was given a new name.
I'll give you one guess as to what group of animals these two mostly worked with.
You're going to tell me it's dinosaurs, aren't you?
It is dinosaurs. They definitely did some other things. So one example of dinosaur that they worked on was Brontosaurus. And I literally have in our notes, Brontosaurus, LOL, because the whole reason that Brontosaurus is a mess and why it probably doesn't exist is because of these two. And at one point, the whole reason that Brontosaurus exists at all is because Othniel Charles Marsh, the one from Yale University, he named Brontosaurus because he put the wrong skull on a skeleton and called it something new.
No.
That is the origin of Brontosaurus.
No.
Yes. I will read it to you straight off of the Wikipedia page here.
That's even stupider than I would have thought how this stuff happened.
Yep. So let's see. It talks for a couple sentences about how Edward Drinker Cope made some mistakes with various things. But then it says, Marsh himself was not infallible. He put the wrong skull on a skeleton of Apatosaurus, the dinosaur that Brontosaurus most likely is, and declared it a new genus, Brontosaurus. So again, that is just one of the many reasons that Brontosaurus should not exist, is because it was a skull on a skeleton that it did not belong to and called an animal.
Was this done?
This was done by accident. This was done completely by accident. He didn't do this maliciously.
Okay. This was not done solely out of like vengeance and trying to do better. This was done in good faith, just very, very poorly.
I wouldn't even say in good faith. I would say in neutral faith, because the only reason that I'm sure that this fell through the cracks was because they were so careless, because they wanted to name more species than the other one. If they were doing good science, this would not have happened. But because they were always in such a rush to get every new species out, they let a lot of things like this fall through the cracks. And we're still cleaning up their mess 150 years later. Like, there's one particular genus that I work with that was named by Marsh, called Pliohippus, which is a horse. And it's a horse from... it got into the Pliocene, but sort of toward the end of the Miocene. So roughly 12-ish million years ago to anywhere as recent as 1 to 2 million years ago, I'd say, I think is the last time we see Pliohippus. But so he named that species, or that genus. And my God, that genus is an absolute mess because there are so many things that people are just like, oh, that is Pliohippus, but a new species of it, because I want to add a tally. And it's like they find a new leg, or even just a couple leg bones, and they're like, new species. But, there are a few things that I would call myself an expert in, but one of the closest things I would call myself an expert in is horse identification, because that's the main part of my master's thesis. And you cannot tell anything other than maybe size about a horse from leg bones. You just can't. You might be able to tell how many toes it has, which is sort of important, but like, as for a species, no, you can't. You cannot tell a new species from leg bones. You just can't.
Did they know this at the time?
Oh yeah, I'm sure they did, because I mean, so I'm trying to think when different things were discovered. I don't know exactly when different specimens are from, but I'm sure that they had, skeletons, whole skeletons of different species of horse by this point. And if you just compared their legs, you'd be like, okay, if it's got 3 toes and are roughly the same size, these legs are exactly the same. Exactly the same. There might be a handful of really, really tiny differences that you might only be able to see on like a perfect specimen. But sort of as we talked about in the fieldwork episode, about, things from the field are literally never perfect, ever. So, or at least very, very rarely perfect.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about that, a whole bunch here about how things in the field are never going to be perfect. And I can only imagine that if that was your whole goal, to be trying to find new species and you had all these leg bones around, that it's a perfect avenue to it's a perfect avenue for some poor science. Because again, if you're looking at things in a textbook or in a laboratory, well, you're probably going to be looking at some pretty pristine specimens that are going to be all reasonably similar to each other. But if you are looking at these leg bone specimens from from the field, where you're going to have different genders of dinosaur, you're going to have, I should say, different sexes of dinosaur, I suppose. You're going to be having different sizes of dinosaur, different types of dinosaur. It's going to make it just all too easy to start doing some bad science with all those different kinds of bones there.
Exactly. And so that's just a lot of things that they didn't think about, or maybe not even didn't think about, but just didn't care about. Because, for example, an example that comes up a lot with sort of, that's called sexual dimorphism, when males and females are different, like deer. Granted, there weren't deer, the family Cervidae, which is the deer family, did not arrive in North America until very, very recently, like somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago. So like there's not a ton of them around. They don't have a very long history in North America, but that's just an example where, the males have antlers. And in some species, they have antlers. I think in some species, they have antlers year round. I think that's mainly only like the really northern ones, like reindeer. I don't think reindeer lose their antlers, but I don't know that for sure. But, you're going to see, you're going to get some skulls with antlers still on them preserved. But then if that's the only difference between males and females, I would be willing to bet a substantial sum of money that Marsh or Cope would have called them a different species if, you had a male and female next to each other. I'm very confident that they would have called them separate species.
They were both doing this. They were, they're kind of both equally guilty on this charge.
Absolutely. And, I'm sure that looking back on it, I think more of Marsh's names held up over time than Cope's did. And so by that, I mean, as we go back through and sort of people do reviews of a particular taxon, which a taxon is basically just a species, a genus, a family, could be at any rank, but an individual one. So it's not like you're doing it between Pliohippus and another closely related horse, Dinohippus. You're not comparing them. It is just of a single group. So as people do reviews of those kinds of things, they say, okay, Pliohippus species 1 and Pliohippus species 2 are actually the same. And so what happens when that happens is whichever one was named first. So even if it was just by, I think in a couple cases, it came down to like a number of hours between something Marsh named and something Cope named. But whichever one was named first stays.
This is like the invention of the telephone. Like whoever was first to patent it, Alexander Graham Bell, beat whoever the other dude was by just a couple hours. And he's the inventor of the telephone and not the other guy whose name I don't remember.
Exactly. But so in that sense, Marsh was better at it because I don't think it's by like a substantial margin, but Marsh does have more species named that are still valid than Cope does. But that just goes to show that like we're still cleaning up their mess. like I said, 150 years later.
That kind of brought me to the next thing I wanted to ask you was just how much lasting damage has this caused?
Well, I mean, the fact that the first dinosaur that most people think of that comes to mind is Brontosaurus is enough of a problem. But besides that, like, just a lot, because it also, they didn't take very good care of their fossils, which is a really big problem, because in paleontology, and a little bit with like modern things, although this isn't nearly as big of an issue, but there is something called a holotype, which is like the specimen. So it's like this specimen here is the example of this species that everything else is compared to. So if you want to figure out, is this, skull Pliohippus or is it something else? You compare it to the holotype specimen. Ideally, you would want that to be a whole skeleton. But with these guys...
That would make sense.
With these guys, sometimes it would just be, So horses, like I said, are what I know best, so I'm going to compare it to them. So horses, they generally don't have a first premolar. So they have premolar, the second premolar through the third molar. And those are called cheek teeth because they're not at the front of their mouth, they're in their cheeks. So I think Pliohippus was named off of a section of cheek teeth, not even the whole tooth row. So what if you find a skull that doesn't have any teeth? Or what if you find a lower jaw? That might be Pliohippus, but like, because the original material doesn't have that, how do you know?
Do you need to have, what was the term for like the specimen that everything else is compared to?
The holotype.
The holotype. What if you just don't have a good enough specimen? Couldn't you just say, yeah, like, we're doing the best we can, but we don't have like the perfect specimen, so we are not going to have a holotype? Isn't that like an option?
That's really tricky. So no, I don't believe so. I believe if you are naming something new, you need to designate a holotype.
Wow. Okay.
What happens, and Pliohippus is kind of a bad example of this because Pliohippus is a very widespread, very common horse. So based on that one sample of the holotype of just those few teeth, we found whole skulls and whole skeletons that we compared to those teeth, and we're like, okay, this is the same. So now we have a whole skeleton of Pliohippus that most people just use that, even though it is not technically the holotype. Sometimes there's all sorts of different type fossils. There's like neotypes, paratypes, most of which are generally used in a similar way, although they're not like the holotype fossil. But so, like I said, Pliohippus is not a great example of that, but I'm sure, especially with the dinosaurs, that they named it off of like, I don't know, a leg bone. And, maybe we haven't found another whole skeleton that has that same leg bone to compare things to. And those, whatever that leg was from and whatever the rest of the skeleton is might be called separate things that we have in collections, but we just don't know because we don't have sort of like the same parts to reference to each other. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what you were saying, is that they just like didn't do a very good job of taking care of their fossils and, kind of doing the boring legwork. Exactly.
So a big part of it was, like I sort of referenced in the fieldwork episode, they did their fieldwork in the summers and would just send wagons and wagons and wagons and trains and trains and trains full of fossils back to their labs, and they would spend the rest of the year naming things and taking the fossils out of the rocks. And I am positive, like I guarantee you, that they just brought so much stuff back that there are still. So when you bring a fossil back from the field, especially a big one, you sort of wrap it in plaster to be able to support it. And that's called a jacket. So I guarantee you that there are jackets from Marsh and Cope still at their respective museums that are not open yet, 150 years later. And so that's how much stuff they brought back. And that was actually a theme that continued up until like the 90s, early 2000s, of just like You find something, you bring it back, even if it's not the most useful or you already have a million of them. That was something that we talked about a lot when I was doing some field work this summer. Is like, okay, we found this part of a jaw of a fish. Cool. We know what fish it is. We've got a couple hundred of them back in our lab. We don't really need this one.
This is completely unrelated, but this reminds me of the scene in Holes. Have you ever seen Holes
Yep.
with Shia LaBeouf?
Yeah.
When he first finds the the fossil of the fish, thinking he's going to get a day off for finding something interesting, and the Dr. Pendansky, I think the guy's name, was like, "Okay, cool fossil, but I could not possibly care less about your fish."
I mean, kind of, just because some fossils are that common. You know, it happens more with invertebrate stuff. You know, when you found one clam, you found a million clams. You know, and of course that's me. That's coming from a vertebrate person, so I'm sure if any clamologists, I don't know the actual term for people who study bivalves, but if there are any clamologists listening, I'm sure I just deeply offended them, and I'm sorry. But you know, some fossils are just not worth collecting. That's just the truth. However, to these guys, they were like, oh, every single jacket could contain something that might possibly, maybe, potentially be another species that I can put on my list. So they collected everything they possibly could. And sort of going off of that, they collected so much that they didn't know what they had. And so many things were just lost. And this is where I get to that sort of sabotage part that I referenced earlier, where obviously these guys were not doing most of this field work themselves. Like, they were there, but they weren't really out digging much themselves. And so they paid people, especially Marsh, because so the Yale Peabody Museum is the name of the big natural history museum at Yale University. So the Peabody guy was his uncle, I believe, one of the richest people in America at the time. So he was incredibly well funded, whereas Cope was not nearly as well funded. He had to work very hard to get the funding that he had. And so Marsh himself definitely was not doing much physical work. Cope, probably toward the end of it when he started to run out of money, was. But they would pay people. They would have these pretty good-sized digging crews that they would pay people for the summer, paid them usually pretty well, to be digging up these fossils. And that included sometimes sending people, and there's very little actual documented evidence of, say, Marsh paying Joe Schmo to go blow up Cope's fossils, because even back then they didn't really want a paper trail. But there is much evidence of the victim of whatever attack, being like, somebody blew up my fossils. Gee, I wonder who it could be. And because of that, like, think of those fossils that were blown up. They blew up fossils because they didn't want the other person to have them. That does not, to me, does not sound like good science. I don't know about you.
No, I mean that sounds like people that are in it for the wrong reasons. And we sort of talked about this in a much different way after Jurassic Park came out. People that are going into paleontology for the wrong reasons, but that's just, that seems like people that just don't care about the science. They care about, whatever might come with getting their name in history books, or I'm not sure, what kind of fame and fortune were going along with this kind of science in the 1800s, but they sure as hell didn't care about the actual, science, or at the very least, there were some other concerns that sound like they were a little bit more pressing to them.
Yes. And so speaking of like the sort of fame and fortune part of it, not that this happened much after he died, I believe, but so Edward Drinker Cope is the holotype for Homo sapiens.
You're kidding.
Nope.
You're kidding.
Nope.
So when we're trying to figure out whether something is a human or not, we've got to use I was about to say a word that was going to make us have an explicit tag on this episode. But we've got to use this guy to compare against whether something else is a human.
Yes, and I'm looking this up to confirm that, but I'm almost positive that is true. So obviously we didn't do this back in the day, because Homo sapiens was named by Linnaeus back in, the late 1700s. So back then, there was no holotype system. And so So, okay, that is not technically true. I guess just looking it up here, it says there's no actual holotype for Homo sapiens. There are a few people who have recently attempted to designate them. The most notorious case involves Edward Drinker Cope's skull, but these designations are not validly done. So there are different ways to do it through something called the International Commission of Zoological Nomenclature, the ICZN. And so you have to go through them whenever you do things like this. If anything, that would be one of those different kinds of type specimens, such as like a neotype would be what I think. If they were to designate a human holotype or human type, it would be a neotype because it is done like after the fact. But yeah, some people have been like, hey, this guy should be the human.
Yeah.
So if that's the kind of
I
fame
don't
and
even know what
fortune
to
you
say to
want, you know.
Who should be, now that I'm thinking about this might be something we need to chew on. Who should be like the human that we hold up as a standard for all else to be compared to?
See, the first thought that comes to my mind is like Tom Hanks.
Ooh, okay.
Or maybe like Morgan Freeman.
Interesting. Okay. So we're going with some like modern day actors. I'm gonna have to chew on this one for a little while because I want to come up with some like historical person. But
are you saying that they're not historical? Like the number of times that Morgan Freeman has played God, like I don't know, that's pretty historic to me.
Between God and the president, yeah.
I mean, you could also just be like, okay, the first fossil, you know, and by first I mean oldest fossil that we know of that we can for sure say is Homo sapiens. If I wanted to actually think about it like as a scientist, that's probably what I would say.
As long as we can call that fossil something cool, or like give it an actual name, like Oprah or something. as long as we can give it a name, I'm cool with it.
All right. So that's anyway. Getting back to getting back to the Bone Wars. So
the Bone Wars.
Oh, Mike. So the final sort of really bad thing that they did was they really overshadowed and forced out some really good scientists, including somebody that actually helped train and educate Cope. For example, somebody who also named a lot of, he worked more with mammals than, like specifically mammals than Cope or Marsh did, who specifically did anything that they found. They were like, oh, I found this thing. It's something new. Cool. Whereas Lighty was more a more focused and more directed sort of expertise where he mostly did mammals. But yeah, his name was Joseph Lighty. And he has many, many species that are still around today. And, several of them are species that I currently work with. So he was a really, really good scientist who has had a lot of his names still hold up over time and not be sort of synonymized is the term that we use for when you combine two species saying that they're the same. So
was it just the case that he was above some of the petty stuff was going on? Was it because he was focused mostly on mammals versus the dinosaurs? What about it? Or was it just, that he liked the science? Like, why was he kind of above the fray of the Bone Wars here?
I think it was a combination of things. So I think it was number, like in no particular order, but number one, that he was a little older than they were. So for example, Marsh was born in 1831. So by this time he was, so let's see, by, we'll say 1880, he was around 50. Whereas Marsh, or Cope, I'm sorry. Whereas Cope, let's see, when was he born? Cope was born 1840. So he was about 10 years younger. And then Lighty, on the other hand, very professional, have all this stuff definitely ahead of time. Joseph Lighty was born 1823. So he was about 20 years older than Cope and about 10 years older than Marsh. So he was a little bit on his way out by this time anyway. Number one. Number two is that there definitely was, like, there are writings from him from the time saying, I don't want to get involved with this. Like, I'm not willing to just go to the lengths that these people are to name things. So, like, there's documentation, letters and things that he wrote at the time. Because I think that there were people, like some of the people that he got funding from, that were like, you need to be spending more time or naming more things. And he's basically just like, no. He's like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do what these two idiots are doing.
That kind of seems like what we've encouraged people before. Like, sometimes the boring stuff, like the stuff that's not going to make it, like that's the good science. And so he was far more interested in doing that kind of a thing than something that might get him fame and fortune.
Exactly. And so I guess the fame and fortune sort of lead us into some of the, I hesitate to say good things with this time period, but there were some positive things to come out of it. So I'd say the biggest positive was that it increased public awareness of paleontology because, a lot of things, museums especially, were not all that popular until this time because people just, weren't potentially that interested until you had a fully mounted, sauropod dinosaur, the kind with the, long neck dinosaur, the kind that's bigger than any other animal that people had ever even seen or even like thought of. So if you see one of those fully mounted, like you see when you walk into, the American Museum of Natural History, where it's reared up on its hind legs, where it's with its neck up, it's, well over 50 feet tall. And so the first time you see that, people are like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And then obviously, as we've already talked about, awareness means money. So all of this awareness, talk about the whole Jurassic Park effect, where there were just more eyes on paleontology because these people were bringing back so many cool bones and of cool things that people just had never seen before. And so with more eyes looking at paleontology means more money being spent on paleontology, which then sort of had like a negative feedback loop because they were like, okay, if bringing back more things gives us money, money is what we need to bring back more things. So the more money we get, the more things we can bring back. And, it just sort of became sort of a vicious cycle in that way.
There are incentives to do things the wrong way. There, with if you want a sports analogy here, I'll give one to you. However many minutes later, there is. If we're talking about, say, baseball, there was incentive to use steroids and do things the wrong way because then you hit home runs and got bigger contracts and you were on the cover of video games. And well, if that's going to keep happening to me, I'll continue using steroids.
Exactly, but unlike the MLB, there was no organization to tell them, hey, you can't do this anymore. So it continued for way longer than it should have. And, it really only ended because Cope ran out of money. That's really it. And then because by that point, Marsh himself died, less than 10 years after the Bone Wars ended. So he died in 1899. Cope died at roughly the same time. Let me look at that too. He died in 1870 or 1897, so only 5 years after the Bone Wars ended. So yeah, as soon as Cope ran out of money, it was kind of over. And with that, paleontology got sort of quote unquote back to normal. But I don't know, I hesitate to say that because there really was no normal before that. Because
they got sober. We can say like they got sober. There was there's we can laugh at that, but there was the period of they were kind of drunk on this high. If you want to mix a couple of drug metaphors, as you can tell, was not really a druggie ever in my life, but they were kind of high on their own supply of all these, discovering these new species and making all this money and raising all this awareness. And then when that kind of runs out, everyone can kind of look around and say, oh, okay, like what we were actually doing was wrong. That everything we were doing just before, just because it was working out for us doesn't mean it was actually, good. Doesn't mean that we should continue doing things this way.
Yeah, exactly. And then sort of one of the last positives that they had was, like I said, like the major impact that it had on museums. So up until now, museums, like I said, were probably not all that popular, and a lot of them didn't even exist. But then once, all these fossils started coming back, people institutions like the American Museum of Natural History in New York, it existed. But then they were like, okay, if we can get some money together to send a team out to find some stuff, and then mount up a dinosaur as quickly as we can. That'll bring in some money for us to send more teams out there. And so museums really benefited a lot from this time period, in that this had more things to put on display, which ultimately is a good thing because that means more people are coming to museums and learning more. So in that sense, it is a great positive. However, like I said, a lot of the science done on the back end was pretty shady. And ultimately, and this goes for a lot of just like history in general, you know, you can't ignore the bad things. Like you can't, it's good to talk about the good things that happened, where, yeah, all these new, species got named, and we have so many more fossils from this time period than we did before. But you can't talk about the good without being like, hey, there was also a lot of really messed up stuff going on from these same people at the same time.
And on that same token, most of this episode was kind of the negative aspects of the Bone Wars and what these guys were doing. But that doesn't mean that we can't also acknowledge, some of the benefits, limited in scope as they may be. That doesn't mean that those positives weren't real or they aren't worth talking about. But it is kind of a reminder that with a lot of this stuff, especially when we're looking back in history, it's kind of hard to all just paint it with one good or bad brush.
Definitely. And like I feel like I did sort of undersell the positives of it because of
You
these two
did.
people and the teams that they had, because obviously it was not just these two people. Like I said, there are books written about some of their field helpers because they just had really interesting lives, and because they did most of like the hard physical work and being out. And I can tell you personally from being out in South Dakota, Wyoming in the summer, it is excruciating sometimes. And so they did a lot of the really hard work of getting these things done. And there were some like really interesting books and things written about some of these folks. But they did give us an enormously better picture of what life was like. The biggest, I guess, like largest profile things that they found were dinosaurs, mostly from the Jurassic period, specifically the Morrison Formation, if that rings a bell to any listeners. One of the most, productive fossil formations, especially of dinosaurs. So that is where dinosaurs like Stegosaurus are from. Allosaurus, one of the most recognizable, theropod, two-leg meat-eating dinosaurs. Let's see what else is from there. Brachiosaurus, the first dinosaur that you see in Jurassic Park, the really tall, long-necked dinosaur. So I don't want to undersell how much better of a picture of past life we now have because of these people. But again, you can't talk about the positives without addressing the negatives.
And that is kind of the story of the Bone Wars. Quite a lot of bad that also comes with a greater understanding and awareness of paleontology, which I did not even know existed. And I'm kind of glad this is sort of you kind of mentioned how there wasn't a normal before the Bone Wars. It seems as though the Bone Wars were sort of, we can almost call it an infancy or maybe a teenage stage for the field of paleontology. This is kind of where the whole discipline itself, there were a lot of bumps along the way and there were some problems and you wouldn't want to go back to it, but it seems as though, and tell me if I'm wrong here, it sort of kind of paved the way for what came next. There was this explosion and this rivalry between these two men, and then once that rivalry went away, once the pieces were picked up, there was a lot of good that was able to come out of this once people were able to see clearly. Is that kind of a way to summarize up the Bone Wars themselves and what they were able to do?
Yeah, I think that is a really good way to phrase it, just because they did so many things, both good and bad, that it just gave later people a lot of stuff to work with. And whether it was studying these new animals or whether it was fixing their mistakes, we haven't run out of things to do for the last 150 years, I'll tell you that. So if you want to become a paleontologist and help clean up the mess of these two people, we'd love to have you.
That is a wonderful, wonderful final pitch. So the Bone Wars. Gavin, is there anything that we have missed on the Bone Wars?
I don't think so. I would say go through and read, like it'll take you a while, but go through and read just the Wikipedia page for the Bone Wars because it is incredibly interesting. And obviously, there is also even, like I said, several books written about it. So one that I have, that I've read most of, I've not finished it. But it's actually written by the same person that wrote Jurassic Park, Michael Crichton, called Dragon Teeth. And that he wrote it before he died, and then it got published in 2017. So he'd been dead for a good bit at that point. But it's sort of like a historical fiction book, but it's like based on many of the like letters that we have written from like these field workers. So it tells the story of like a field worker who was working for at various times throughout the book, both Cope and Marsh. So it's based on many of the letters and interactions and various documents that we have from the time. It's called Dragon Teeth.
Realistic historical fiction.
Yes. Yeah. So that's a really, really cool book. There's another book that is also sort of a historical fiction that I'm sort of just looking at on the Wikipedia page as well. That's okay. This one actually sounds a little cheesy, but it's called Every Hidden Thing. It's based on, right from the Wikipedia page, features the fictional children of two scientists based on Cope and Marsh as they live their own Romeo and Juliet style adventure in the midst of the Bone Wars. So if you like historical romance with some science thrown in, maybe that's an option.
About the Bone Wars.
Yes. And then
Every hidden thing of the Bone Wars. What could you be hiding in the Bone Wars?
And let's see. There's also an episode of the Comedy Central show Drunk History about the Bone Wars as well.
Wonderful. I have on occasion played some episodes of Drunk History in my classes, and it is usually a good time, a lighthearted way to learn some things. Is that about it on the Bone Wars? Can we close the page?
I think so. Like I said, I mean, we'll have a link to like the Wikipedia page and maybe some other sources and things that I think might be worth reading through. But yeah, like I said, it'll take you a good bit because the Wikipedia page for this is quite long, but it is worth a read because it just goes to show there's even like some politics thrown in because obviously lobbying was just as alive and well then as it is today. And so they did a fair bit of lobbying with Congress. So if you want a little bit of political theatrics, if you're tired enough of the ones we have going on today, you can escape to some of the past. So really interesting stuff to just sort of read about. And with that, I think we're good to wrap it up.
Awesome. That is wonderful. Speaking of political theatrics, next time you guys hear us will be on Inauguration Day 2021, Ooh. January 20th. So look out for that. Well, I'm not sure what the woof was for. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, I am too. I'm just we'll see how things shape up. Not like on Capitol Hill, like I'm not concerned about that, but just in other places around the country, you know.
I couldn't agree more with all of that. So we will see you guys next week. We will talk to you then. Until next time, we see you guys though. Happy boning.
Oh my God, Mike, why?
Hey everyone, Mike here. Just a quick editor's note as we are putting this episode out. I didn't want to take out the part where Gavin was talking about Capitol Hill, but this episode was recorded before the events of Wednesday, January 6th, I believe it was, when there was, of course, the rioters that stormed the Capitol. That joke had nothing to do with that because it had not happened at the time we recorded that. Just wanted to make that note. Thank you, and I hope you guys enjoyed this episode.